Lucas Hunt had never considered himself the kind of man to get entangled in neighborhood disputes. When he purchased the old craftsman-style house on the outskirts of town, he envisioned a quiet life, one where he could focus on running his small coffee shop downtown and tending to his sprawling backyard garden on weekends. The house itself had charm: a wraparound porch, solid wood floors, and a deep backyard with enough space to grow vegetables, install a greenhouse, and maybe even build a koi pond one day. More than anything, Lucas had been drawn to the sense of self-sufficiency that came with owning property. The house was not part of a larger neighborhood association. It sat on a private lot, free from the bureaucratic nonsense that plagued suburban developments. That was one of the reasons he had chosen it. Another major selling point had been the independent water source. The house was connected to an old but well-maintained private well system, meaning he wasn't at the mercy of municipal water rates. That alone had convinced him that this was the right place. He had spent the first few months upgrading the filtration system, replacing outdated pipes, and investing in a professional-grade water softener. Water was important to him not just for drinking, but for everything. His coffee shop relied on high-quality filtered water, and his plans for the backyard garden required a steady, dependable supply. Everything had seemed perfect. At first, the neighborhood had been exactly as quiet and peaceful as he had hoped. Most of his neighbors were older, long-time residents who kept to themselves. There were no loud parties, no petty dramas, no reason to think that his presence would be unwelcome. The only person who had made an effort to introduce himself was Randall Wakefield, a man in his late 50s who lived in the weathered gray house next door. He had shown up at Lucas's porch one afternoon with a bottle of wine and a polite but somewhat assessing gaze. There had been something about him, an air of casual authority, as if he were used to being the one who set the tone in the area. Lucas had appreciated the gesture but had quickly sensed that Randall was not just being neighborly. He was trying to gauge him, to figure out what kind of person he had moved in next to. During their brief conversation, Randall had asked about Lucas's work, his background, whether he planned to make any big changes to the property. It had struck Lucas as a strange question at the time. What kind of changes would he even be referring to? Lucas had simply shrugged and mentioned his garden plans, and Randall had nodded with what had seemed like forced enthusiasm. There had been something faintly dismissive in the way he responded, as if he had already decided something about Lucas and didn't feel the need to hide it. But after that, their interactions had been limited to polite nods and passing, and Lucas had thought little of it. Then, about 3 months after he moved in, the water pressure started dropping. At first, he barely noticed. It would happen in the early mornings or late at night times when he wasn't using much water anyway. But then it became more pronounced. One day, as he was washing dishes, the faucet sputtered violently before reducing to a weak trickle. He had checked the filtration system, assuming it was a clog, but everything appeared to be in working order. The problem seemed intermittent, but when it happened, it was impossible to ignore. Showers turned into frustrating exercises in patience, and watering the garden took twice as long as it should have. Then came the real red flag: the water quality changed. One morning, he filled a glass from the kitchen tap and noticed a faintly metallic taste. Inspecting the water more closely, he saw that it had a slight yellowish tint, something that had never been an issue before. Concerned, he checked the filters, but they weren't clogged or damaged. Still, he replaced them just to be sure. For a while, the problem seemed to resolve itself, but then the next week, it returned worse than before. Lucas had called a licensed plumber, expecting to be told that there was some minor issue with the pipes. But after an extensive inspection of the system, the plumber had emerged from the basement with a strange look on his face. "You said this is a private well, right?" Lucas nodded. The plumber wiped his hands on a rag and frowned. "Then you've got a problem. Someone tapped into your line." The words took a moment to sink in. "What do you mean?" "I mean, your water supply isn't just feeding your house anymore," the plumber said. "There's a secondary connection, and it's drawing a pretty significant amount." Lucas stared at him, disbelieving. "How is that even possible?" "Well, I can tell you it didn't happen by accident. Someone deliberately rerouted part of your system. It's not obvious at first glance, but whoever did it knew what they were doing." The implications hit him like a brick to the chest. And where exactly is it going? The plumber hesitated. Your next-door neighbor. Lucas felt his stomach tighten. Randall. At first he thought there had to be some kind of mistake. Maybe there had been an old, undocumented connection between the two properties that neither he nor Randall had known about. Maybe it was some oversight from decades ago that had never been corrected. But deep down, something told him that wasn't the case. Randall had lived in that house for years. If this had been an issue before, he would have mentioned it. No, this was intentional. Lucas had thanked the plumber and paid him for his time, but by the time he was alone in his house again, he felt an unfamiliar surge of anger building in his chest. His neighbor had stolen from him. Not just stolen, violated his property, taken advantage of the fact that Lucas had trusted that everything was as it should be. It was only then that he started remembering the subtle, seemingly insignificant moments that suddenly made so much more sense. The way Randall had asked, early on, if Lucas planned to make any big changes. The way he had seemed oddly interested in Lucas's water system whenever they had talked. The way he had never once complained about his own water bills, despite using more water than anyone else on the street, constantly washing his cars, running sprinklers for hours, keeping his lawn unnaturally green even during the driest weeks. Lucas clenched his jaw. He wasn't the type to let things slide. If Randall thought he could get away with this, he was about to find out just how wrong he was. He was going to confront his neighbor. And Randall Wakefield had a lot of explaining to do. Lucas didn't waste time. The moment the plumber left, he took a few minutes to gather his thoughts, trying to temper the frustration boiling inside him. Confronting someone in anger rarely led to a productive conversation, and while every instinct in his body screamed that Randall had intentionally stolen from him, he had to at least give him the opportunity to explain himself. Maybe, just maybe, there was an innocent explanation, a misunderstanding, a long-forgotten connection between the properties that had never been corrected. But the more he thought about it, the more unlikely that seemed. This had been deliberate. Someone had gone out of their way to alter his plumbing, and Randall was the only person who could have benefited from it. He walked over to his neighbor's house, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to push down the irritation that threatened to show itself in his body language. Randall's house looked the same as always, well kept, unassuming, with its neatly trimmed hedges and spotless driveway. There was nothing outwardly sinister about it, and yet now, standing in front of it, Lucas couldn't help but see it differently. This was the home of someone who had taken from him without a second thought. He knocked on the door firmly, taking a step back, crossing his arms as he waited. It took nearly a full minute before he heard movement inside, the sound of someone walking hesitant, slow. Then the door opened, and there was Randall, looking mildly surprised to see him standing there. He was wearing a light flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, his posture relaxed, but his expression gave something away, not shock, but calculation. As if he were quickly assessing the situation, deciding how he wanted to react. "Lucas," he said smoothly, offering a small nod. "Didn't expect to see you today. Everything all right?" Lucas held his gaze. "No, actually. We need to talk." Randall lifted a brow but didn't immediately step aside to invite him in. "All right, what's on your mind?" "I had a plumber come by today. Water pressure's been low lately, so I wanted to get it checked out." Randall didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. If anything, his expression turned more neutral. "That right? Find anything." Lucas clenched his jaw. This man wasn't going to make it easy. "Yeah, found out someone rerouted my water supply, hooked it into your house." Randall blinked once, slowly. Then, to Lucas's growing irritation, he let out a quiet chuckle. "Oh," he said, shaking his head slightly, as if this was all some kind of mild inconvenience rather than outright theft. "Yeah, that." Lucas stiffened. "That? That?" He was acting like this was nothing. Like Lucas had just pointed out a leaky faucet instead of a blatant act of trespassing and resource theft. "So you admit it?" Lucas asked, his voice sharper than before. Randall sighed, rubbing a hand along his jaw as if he had hoped this conversation wouldn't happen. "Look, don't make a big deal out of this, all right? It's just water. It's not like I'm draining your bank account or breaking into your house. We've always had a bit of a shared system around here. You're new, so you wouldn't know, but back in the day, a lot of these houses had their plumbing set up in ways that—" I saw the connection. Randall Lucas interrupted, voice hardening. "It wasn't some old system from back in the day, it was done recently, and without my knowledge." Randall exhaled, shaking his head again like Lucas was overreacting, like this was nothing worth getting upset about. "Look," he said, crossing his arms, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that made Lucas's teeth clench. "You've got a strong system over there. Your filters, that's high-quality stuff. I figured, why not spread it around a little? It's not like you're hurting for water. And, I got kids that visit. Grandkids, actually, they come over, they run the sprinklers. They play in the yard. It's not a big deal, Lucas." Lucas felt his hands ball into fists at his sides, forcing himself to stay composed. "It is a big deal," he said evenly. "Because it's my water. My property. My system. You didn't ask. You didn't even tell me. You just decided that because you wanted something, you could take it. That's not how this works." Randall sighed again, like he was dealing with someone being unreasonable. "You need to relax," he said, putting his hands up as if that would somehow de-escalate things. "If it's really such an issue for you, fine. I'll turn it off. But you don't need to get all worked up about it." Lucas stared at him, searching for any hint of sincerity, but all he saw was thinly veiled condescension. This wasn't an apology. This wasn't an admission of guilt. Randall wasn't sorry, he was just annoyed that he'd been caught. "You'll turn it off," Lucas repeated. Randall nodded. "Yeah, I'll take care of it. Just give me a couple days." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "You'll take care of it?" "No, I'll take care of it." Randall exhaled sharply through his nose, looking away for a moment before turning back with a forced smile. "Fine," he said. "Do whatever you need to do." Lucas held his gaze a moment longer before turning on his heel and walking away, his pulse pounding in his ears. That was too easy. He didn't believe for a second that Randall was just going to let it go. By the time he got back to his house, he had already decided he wasn't waiting for Randall to do anything. That night, he would shut the connection down himself. It was late when he went out, armed with a wrench and a flashlight, determined to cut off the unauthorized line once and for all. The night air was cool, the quiet of the neighborhood pressing around him as he made his way to the access point. He crouched down, gripping the wrench, twisting the valve shut with deliberate force, severing the flow that had been illegally redirected. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of control returning, but then just as he was about to head back inside, he noticed something. A thin, plastic-coated wire, barely visible in the dim light, running alongside the pipe. His breath caught. That hadn't been there before. He followed it with his eyes, tracing its path through the dirt, leading toward Randall's property. And that's when it hit him. Randall hadn't just been stealing water, he had been monitoring it. Lucas slowly straightened, the weight of the realization settling deep in his chest. This wasn't over, not even close. Lucas stood there for a long moment, staring at the thin, plastic-coated wire running along the freshly disturbed earth. It wasn't thick, just a narrow conduit, half buried in the dirt, blending seamlessly with the pipe he had just shut off. If he hadn't been looking closely, he might have missed it entirely. The realization hit him like a slow-moving landslide, a weight sinking into his chest as his mind worked through the implications. Randall hadn't just stolen from him, he had been monitoring the flow of water. He had set something up, a system to track when Lucas might tamper with it. Lucas crouched, brushing away some of the dirt with his fingers. The wire ran deeper into the ground, disappearing toward Randall's property. His first thought was that it could be some cheaply rigged sensor, maybe something designed to trigger an alert when the flow of water was interrupted. If Randall had gone through the trouble of tapping into his system, it wasn't far-fetched to think he had also put something in place to make sure he would know if it was disturbed. But the more he considered it, the worse the possibilities became. Was it just a basic monitoring system? Or something more invasive? Lucas exhaled slowly, forcing himself to think logically. He had to be careful. If Randall had gone to these lengths, it meant one of two things: either he was overconfident in his ability to manipulate the situation, or he was afraid of being exposed and was using whatever means necessary to maintain control. Either way, Lucas needed to know what he was dealing with before making his next move. He wasn't about to rip out the wire blindly. If it was connected to something in Randall's house, there was a chance that tampering with it immediately would set off some kind of alert. Maybe nothing obvious, but enough to tip Randall off that Lucas was actively digging into the situation rather than just reacting to it. And that was the last thing he wanted right now. Slowly he straightened, rolling his shoulders as he glanced toward Randall's house. The lights were off, no movement behind the curtains. Either his neighbor was asleep or pretending to be. Lucas had no doubt that Randall had been watching him earlier, reading his body language, gauging whether or not he was truly backing down or simply biding his time. And that was exactly what Lucas planned to do, for now. The next morning, he made a call to a trusted electrician, someone he had worked with before at his coffee shop when they had needed rewiring done. He framed the request as casually as possible, saying he had found an old, unknown wire near his plumbing system and wanted to know what it was connected to before removing it. The electrician agreed to stop by later in the day, and Lucas spent the hours leading up to the appointment carefully going about his normal routine, making sure he wasn't doing anything that might tip Randall off. He watered the plants, adjusted the irrigation timers, even took the time to clean his gutters, anything to make it look like he wasn't thinking about last night, even though it was all he could think about. When the electrician arrived, he led him to the spot, watching as the man inspected the wire with a thoughtful frown. "This isn't standard," he said after a moment, pulling out a small tool to test for a current. "It's carrying a weak electrical signal. That usually means it's either connected to a sensor or some kind of remote system." Lucas felt his jaw tighten. Meaning if I were to guess, this is either monitoring water flow or it's tied into something that sends a wireless signal when there's a disruption. You said your neighbor's property is on the other end of this. Lucas nodded. The electrician exhaled through his nose. "Then I'd say he's got something set up in his house that tells him when you mess with the water supply. Probably not anything fancy, could just be a basic relay system. But the fact that it's here at all, that's not normal." Not normal. Lucas almost laughed at the understatement. He nodded, keeping his voice even. "Can you disconnect it without triggering anything?" The electrician hesitated. "If it's active, cutting it without knowing where it leads could do anything from tripping an alarm to shutting off whatever system it's controlling. If you want to be safe, you'd need to trace it back to its source and disable it from there." Lucas exhaled slowly, already knowing what that meant. He would need to get into Randall's property or at least find a way to figure out where the wire ended. And there was no way Randall was going to let him snoop around freely. The electrician left after securing the exposed section, making sure it wouldn't short out if it rained. Lucas thanked him, paid for his time, and then spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about his next move. That evening he noticed something that made his skin crawl. Randall was watching him. Not openly, not in an obvious way. But when Lucas looked out his window toward his neighbor's house, he could see a subtle shift of the blinds, just enough for someone inside to get a glimpse of him. Randall wasn't avoiding confrontation anymore. He was waiting, watching, trying to read what Lucas was going to do next. And Lucas refused to give him the satisfaction of knowing. Instead of reacting, he moved deliberately, keeping his posture neutral, going about his evening as if nothing was wrong. He made dinner, turned on the TV for background noise, and went outside to check on the garden. If Randall thought Lucas was backing down, then he had the upper hand. But Lucas wasn't backing down. Late that night, when everything was still and silent, he went back to the pipe. This time he was careful. He didn't touch the wire, didn't risk setting anything off. Instead, he planted something of his own, a small, nearly invisible fiber optic camera, positioned just right so it could capture the exact area where the wire disappeared into the ground. It wasn't a high-end surveillance device, but it was enough to do what he needed it to do. And it worked. The next morning he checked the footage and saw Randall. At 4:23 a.m., while the entire neighborhood had been asleep, Randall had come outside with a flashlight, crouching near the pipe. He had checked the wire, running his fingers along it, pausing when he reached the section where Lucas had shut off the water supply. Then, after a moment of hesitation, he had done something Lucas hadn't expected. He had dug up the connection and reattached it. Lucas felt his pulse pound in his ears as he watched the footage over and over again. Randall hadn't just checked, he had deliberately restored the illegal connection. He hadn't given up. He had simply waited for an opportunity to put everything back the way it was. And that meant one thing. Randall didn't think Lucas was a threat, not yet. But he would. Lucas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly as a dangerous sense of clarity settled over him. This wasn't about water anymore. It was about control. And if Randall wanted a fight, he was about to get one. Lucas knew he was out of time for patience. He had spent days trying to handle this carefully, hoping that by confronting Randall directly, by proving he knew exactly what was going on, he could put an end to it before things escalated further. But after watching the footage of Randall creeping out in the middle of the night, reconnecting the stolen water line as if nothing had happened, Lucas finally understood the truth. Randall wasn't just stealing, he was asserting control. This wasn't about necessity, convenience, or even money. It was about dominance. Randall had taken from him, had been caught, and instead of backing down, he had doubled down, as if daring Lucas to try and stop him again. The worst part was that it had worked. Randall had tested the boundaries, pushed to see if Lucas would actually do something about it, and when no real consequences followed, he had simply carried on as usual. That had been Lucas's mistake. He had assumed that confronting the issue with logic and proof would force Randall's hand, but logic didn't work on people who believed they were untouchable. If Lucas wanted this to end, he had to strip Randall of that certainty, make him feel vulnerable in a way that he hadn't before. That morning, Lucas didn't touch the water supply. He didn't shut off the connection again, didn't dig up the pipe, didn't make any visible move to stop Randall. Instead, he went about his day as if nothing had changed. He had breakfast on his porch, drank his coffee slowly, and let his gaze drift casually across the street. He could feel Randall watching him again, not from inside the house this time, but from his front yard. The man was pretending to check his mailbox, shuffling through some envelopes, but Lucas could tell it was a cover, a way to observe without being obvious about it. Fine. If Randall wanted to watch him, then Lucas would give him something to see. He finished his coffee, went inside to clean up the kitchen, and then left the house, getting into his truck and heading toward town. But he wasn't going to work. He drove to a specialized plumbing supplier, one that dealt not just in standard household repairs but in commercial-grade equipment, industrial shut-off systems, and high-security fixtures meant to withstand serious tampering. He walked the aisles carefully, taking his time examining the options, making sure to ask detailed questions about pressure-locked valves, tamper-resistant fittings, and underground shut-off systems that required specialized tools to access. He wasn't just looking to cut Randall off, he wanted to make sure that when he did, there was no quick way back in. The clerk, a gruff-looking older man who had clearly been in the business for decades, gave him a curious look as he inspected a heavy-duty valve system designed for commercial irrigation lines. Most people don't need this kind of setup for residential use, he commented, folding his arms. You running a business out of your property? Lucas gave him a tight smile. Let's just say I've got a persistent plumbing problem I need to take care of. The man smirked at that but didn't press the issue. By the time Lucas left the store, he had everything he needed, not just a way to permanently cut off Randall's access, but a system that would ensure any future tampering would be immediately obvious. No more sneaking out in the middle of the night, no more silent reconnections. If Randall wanted the water back after this, he'd have to dig up the entire line, and there would be no denying what he had been doing when Lucas caught him. But Lucas wasn't done yet. Instead of going home, he made another stop, a law office that specialized in property disputes. He wasn't filing anything yet, not officially, but he wanted to know exactly what his options were if Randall refused to back down. He had already learned that going to the city wouldn't accomplish much. Bureaucracy moved too slowly, and cases like this had a way of dragging on for months with no real resolution. If he wanted leverage, he had to understand what legal ground he had to stand on. The attorney, A sharp-eyed woman named Vanessa Rains listened carefully as Lucas laid out the situation, detailing the unauthorized connection, the repeated trespassing, and the blatant refusal to stop even after being confronted. She didn't look surprised. If anything, she looked mildly annoyed, as if this was something she had heard too many times before. "Let me guess," she said dryly. "He acts like it's no big deal, tells you to relax about it, maybe even tries to make you feel like you're overreacting." Lucas exhaled. "Pretty much." Vanessa nodded, flipping through a few documents before looking up at him again. "Legally, you're in the right. He has no claim to your water, no right to make any changes to your system, and if you wanted to, you could sue for damages. But cases like this, they get messy. You file a cease and desist, and if he ignores it, you're looking at a civil lawsuit, which means court dates, legal fees, and months of back and forth. If he's bold enough to keep doing this even after being confronted, I can guarantee he's the type who will dig his heels in and make things as difficult as possible for you." Lucas nodded. "So what's my best move?" Vanessa leaned back in her chair. "The fastest way to shut this down? Cut off his access in a way he can't easily reverse. Make it so that if he wants to get that connection back, he has to do something blatantly illegal, something you can prove beyond a doubt. That way, it's not just a civil dispute, it's a criminal act." That was all Lucas needed to hear. That night, after sunset, Lucas got to work. He moved quickly, carefully installing the new shut-off system, replacing the old pipe connection with a buried pressure lock mechanism that couldn't be accessed without specialized tools. It was deep underground now, encased in reinforced casing that required heavy-duty equipment to reach. Randall wouldn't just be able to twist a valve back into place this time. If he wanted to get that water back, he would have to dig up the entire system. And then Lucas waited. It didn't take long. At 3:47 a.m., his hidden camera picked up exactly what he had been expecting: Randall, creeping out under the cover of darkness, flashlight in hand, going straight for the connection. Lucas watched the footage the next morning, his expression unreadable as he observed Randall's movements. At first, his neighbor seemed confident. He reached for the usual connection point, expecting to find the same old valve he had twisted back into place so many times before. Then he froze. Lucas watched as Randall checked again, his posture stiffening as he realized the connection was gone. He crouched lower, ran his hands along the pipe, clearly trying to figure out what had changed. Then, after a few more moments of searching, he finally understood. The frustration was visible, even through the grainy night vision feed. Randall pushed back, muttered something under his breath, and then, in a final act of pure frustration, he kicked at the dirt near the pipe before storming off back to his house. Lucas leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Now the pressure was on Randall. For the first time, the man had been denied what he wanted, and men like Randall didn't take losing well. Lucas knew what came next. Randall would retaliate. The only question was how far he was willing to go. Lucas woke up the next morning with the distinct feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the satisfaction of knowing that Randall had finally run into a wall he couldn't immediately push through it. It was the certainty that Randall wouldn't simply accept this loss. Men like him, the kind who operated under the belief that the world bent to their will, didn't handle failure well. The footage had shown him all he needed to know. Randall had been blindsided by the new lockout system, had fumbled at the ground like a man desperately trying to reclaim something he felt entitled to, and when he had realized he was powerless to undo what had been done, his frustration had turned to pure, simmering anger. Lucas had expected retaliation, but what he didn't know was how soon it would come or how far Randall was willing to go. He didn't have to wait long for his answer. By midday, Lucas noticed the first sign that Randall had changed tactics. His water pressure was still normal, the connection remained locked, and there was no evidence that Randall had attempted to dig up the pipe again, but there was a new development. A white envelope had been slipped under his door. There was no stamp, no return address, just his name scrawled in bold, deliberate handwriting. He hesitated before opening it, already knowing who it was from, already expecting the kind of passive-aggressive arrogance that Randall exuded every time he was challenged. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. We both know you don't need all that water. You're just trying to make a point. But let's be honest, you moved into a place with a system that's been in place for years. You're the one trying to change things, not me. If you weren't so stubborn, this wouldn't have to turn into something ugly. There was no signature. None was needed. The implication was clear. Lucas stared at the note, weighing the meaning behind the words. It wasn't an apology or an attempt to smooth things over, it was a warning, a thinly veiled reminder that Randall still believed he had the upper hand. The phrasing was deliberate, designed to make it seem as if Lucas was the unreasonable one, as if he was the outsider disrupting some unspoken agreement that had existed long before he had moved in. It was a manipulation tactic, one that Randall likely used on people who weren't used to standing their ground. Lucas wasn't one of those people. He tore the note in half and threw it away. That night, he double-checked the water lines, ensuring that nothing had been tampered with, then set up another small camera near the perimeter of his property. If Randall wasn't going to try and take the water back by force, then he would find another way to exert control, and Lucas needed to be ready for whatever that was. He had spent enough time playing defense. If Randall wanted to keep escalating, then Lucas was going to make sure that every step he took would be recorded, documented, and used against him. The next escalation came 2 days later. Lucas woke up early, as he always did, ready to check on the garden before heading into town. But as soon as he stepped outside, he noticed something was wrong. His front yard, normally well-maintained and orderly, was covered in spray-painted markings, bright, fluorescent orange and blue lines, the kind utility companies use to indicate underground infrastructure. They crisscrossed his lawn, some stretching toward the water lines, others leading toward his driveway. At first glance, it almost looked official, but Lucas knew better. No work had been scheduled, no notices had been given. And there was only one person who would have gone through the trouble of doing something like this. Randall was playing a new game. Lucas didn't react, didn't go banging on Randall's door demanding answers. That was what he wanted to draw him into an argument, to force him into a conversation where he could try and spin the situation in his favor again. Instead, Lucas went back inside, calmly made a phone call to the city's public works department, and asked if there had been any planned maintenance or inspections in the area. As expected, the answer was no. No one had sent a crew, no one had marked his property for excavation, which meant Randall had done this himself, or had convinced someone else to do it on his behalf. Lucas knew why. If Randall couldn't take back the water the way he wanted, then he would try to create a problem that forced Lucas to react. Maybe he was hoping Lucas would dig up the system again, give him an excuse to claim property damage, or maybe he was setting the stage for something bigger. Whatever the case, Lucas wasn't playing along. He called a private contractor, paid for a real inspection, and made sure that when the time came, he would have an official record proving that the markings had been fraudulent. Randall didn't stop there. That evening, Lucas found his backyard sprinkler system completely dismantled. The pipes had been removed, the connections severed, but there was no sign of forced entry, no broken locks, no footprints leading to the area. It was a message, a silent, calculated one. Randall wasn't acting out of desperation. He was planning every move, testing Lucas, waiting to see what it would take to make him crack first. Lucas took a slow breath and put everything back together, making sure to document the damage, noting every missing part, every altered connection. He didn't confront Randall. He didn't acknowledge what had happened. He let the tension hang in the air, let Randall wonder if his tactics were working, let him sit in the uncertainty of whether or not Lucas was preparing to retaliate. Randall had made a mistake. He had assumed that Lucas would be like everyone else before him, someone who would eventually get tired, frustrated, worn down by the constant pressure. But what he didn't realize was that Lucas had already shifted his mindset. This wasn't a fight about water anymore. It was about who had control over the situation, over the property, over the outcome. So Lucas made a decision. He contacted Vanessa Raines again, this time with a formal request to begin legal action. Randall wanted to play a long game, to manipulate and pressure him into submission, but Lucas was changing the rules. He provided all the documentation, the unauthorized connection, the footage of Randall tampering with the water supply, the fraudulent utility markings, the vandalized sprinkler system. He wasn't just building a case. He was preparing for the moment Randall made his biggest mistake yet, and he knew it was coming soon. Randall was out of subtle tactics. He had tried stealing, intimidation, manipulation, and passive-aggressive warnings. The only thing left was something reckless. Lucas wasn't just waiting for it, he was ready for it. Lucas had expected retaliation, but what came next was worse than he anticipated. The moment he officially moved forward with legal action, Randall lost the last shred of patience he had been clinging to, and it became clear that he was no longer trying to manipulate the situation in his favor, he was trying to break Lucas. It started with the small things, the kinds of petty inconveniences that were meant to chip away at his resolve. The morning after he met with Vanessa Raines to finalize the case, he found deep tire tracks in his front yard, like someone had deliberately driven in circles on his lawn, tearing up the soil and leaving ruts too deep to ignore. That same night, his motion-activated security lights flickered on and off repeatedly, but when he checked the cameras, there was no sign of movement. The next day, his mailbox was ripped open, the hinge barely hanging on, the contents scattered across the driveway as if someone had dug through them, looking for something. None of it was enough to justify calling the police. None of it was provable beyond a reasonable doubt, but it was calculated psychological pressure, designed to make him feel like he was under siege. Lucas didn't react. He documented everything, added it to the file he was compiling, and refused to acknowledge Randall's tactics. That silence, that complete lack of engagement, was what finally pushed Randall to make his move. It happened just before midnight. Lucas had been expecting something, had spent the evening going through every security measure, ensuring the cameras were working, the water lines remained intact, the locks and windows were secured. When the first noise came, he was ready. A metallic clank, followed by a dull scraping sound, low but unmistakable. Someone was at the waterline again. Lucas stayed still, watching the monitor as the motion-activated camera near the shutoff system flickered to life. The infrared feed was grainy, but the figure was unmistakable Randall, crouched near the pipe, tools in hand, trying to dig through the reinforced seal. Lucas didn't hesitate. He stepped outside, moving swiftly but without making a sound, approaching from the side rather than the front, ensuring he wouldn't be seen until it was too late. He could hear Randall's breathing, sharp and uneven, could hear the scrape of metal against metal as he struggled to undo the work that had locked him out. Lucas let him get just far enough, let him believe for one last moment that he could still get away with it. Then he spoke. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." Randall froze. His shoulders stiffened, his hands clenched around the tool he had been using. For a long moment he didn't move, didn't even breathe. Then, slowly, he turned his head, eyes glinting in the dim light. There was no guilt in his expression, no shame, only anger, the kind that came from a man who had just realized he had lost control of a game he thought he was winning. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Lucas continued, stepping closer. His voice was even, measured, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Randall exhaled sharply through his nose, straightening to his full height, his grip tightening on the wrench in his hand. "Fixing a problem," he said. Lucas let out a quiet, humorless laugh. "Is that what you call this? Because from where I'm standing it looks an awful lot like criminal trespassing and property damage." Randall's jaw twitched. "You don't get it," he said, shaking his head slightly, his voice lower now, more controlled but laced with barely restrained frustration. "You came in here and started changing things like you own the place. This neighborhood, this system, it worked just fine before you showed up and started acting like you were better than the rest of us." Lucas narrowed his eyes. "You mean before I stopped letting you steal from me?" Randall's expression darkened. For a moment he looked like he might take a swing, his fingers flexing around the wrench, his shoulders tensing, as if he was calculating whether or not violence was his best option. Lucas didn't flinch. He just stood there, watching, waiting. He could see the hesitation in Randall's eyes, the flicker of uncertainty that came from realizing that this wouldn't end the way he wanted it to. And then, just like that, the tension broke. Randall exhaled sharply, throwing the wrench onto the ground with a loud metallic clang before stepping back, his lips curling into a bitter, mocking smirk. "Fine," he said. "You win. You got what you wanted." Lucas didn't move. "Did I?" Randall held his gaze for a long, silent moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Lucas waited until he was gone, waited until the sound of his retreating footsteps had disappeared into the night before picking up the wrench Randall had left behind. His hands were steady, his pulse even. He should have felt relieved. He had backed Randall into a corner, had forced him to realize that no amount of manipulation or intimidation was going to make him fold. But he also knew men like Randall didn't just walk away. This wasn't over. Not yet. Lucas stepped back inside, locking the door behind him, and reached for his phone. It was time to make sure Randall couldn't pull another stunt like this again. The next morning, he filed a police report. He provided the footage, the timestamps, the physical evidence of the attempted break-in at the waterline. He knew it might not result in an immediate arrest. Randall hadn't caused enough damage for that, but it was on record now, a formal acknowledgement that the situation had escalated past a civil dispute. Randall didn't come near his property again after that. He didn't try to reconnect the water, didn't leave another note, didn't so much as look in Lucas's direction. But Lucas knew that wasn't the end of it. Randall hadn't given up. He had just shifted tactics, retreating to plan his next move. Lucas was ready for it. Because now Randall wasn't just a thief, he was a man with nothing left to lose, and that made him dangerous. Lucas knew better than to assume that silence meant surrender. Randall had backed off, but only in the way a wounded predator retreats into the shadows, not out of fear, not because he had accepted defeat, but because he was calculating his next move. That was the kind of man he was. He had been unchecked for too long, had spent years getting away with small infractions, bending rules, convincing people that his way was the natural order of things. Lucas had seen the type before, men who believed control was theirs by default, who saw resistance as an inconvenience rather than a true obstacle. Randall had spent weeks pushing, seeing how far Lucas would bend, and now with the police report filed, with official documentation proving that Lucas wasn't afraid to escalate, he had been forced to step back. But not permanently. Lucas wasn't naive enough to think this was over, not when Randall still had cards left to play. For days there was nothing. No tampering, no messages, no signs of retaliation. But Lucas felt the shift, the way neighbors suddenly seemed more distant, the way conversations cut off when he approached, the way even the cashier at the local grocery store hesitated before greeting him. Randall wasn't attacking directly anymore. He was poisoning the air around Lucas, turning him into the problem, the outsider, the man who had come in and disrupted the so-called harmony of the neighborhood. It was an old trick, a classic manipulation technique, social isolation, making Lucas feel alone, making him doubt whether the fight had been worth it. Maybe Randall thought he would crack, would start questioning whether it would have been easier to just let things go, to find some compromise that let both of them walk away without further conflict. But Lucas wasn't questioning anything. He had already decided that there was no compromise with people like Randall. There was only winning or losing, and Lucas wasn't going to lose. He waited, watched, kept an eye on his security feeds, checked the water lines daily, maintained the reinforced shutoff system with the same diligence as locking his front door at night. And then, on a cold Thursday morning, Randall made his final mistake. It started with the knocking. Not at the door, but at the side of the house, a dull, rhythmic thudding that sent vibrations through the walls. Lucas had been in the kitchen, drinking coffee, and the moment he heard it, he set the mug down carefully, his mind already working through possibilities. He didn't rush to the window, didn't move toward the door. Instead, he took his time, circling toward the back of the house where he could get a better vantage point of the side yard without making his presence obvious. And that's when he saw him. Randall. He was standing next to the exterior plumbing access point, a crowbar in hand, his body half turned away as if he were trying to work quickly, to finish whatever he had planned before Lucas had the chance to stop him. There was no pretense anymore, no excuses about fixing something or checking the lines. This was deliberate, intentional destruction. Lucas didn't hesitate. He stepped out, his voice low, firm, leaving no room for negotiation. You really thought this was a good idea? Randall flinched, but only for a second. Then, slowly he turned to face Lucas, and the expression on his face wasn't one of surprise or guilt. It was something worse. Amusement. You filed a police report on me, Randall said, rolling his shoulders as if he were preparing for a fight. So I figured I might as well give you something worth reporting. Lucas didn't react. Didn't take the bait. He had expected a last-ditch effort, but this was reckless, desperate. Randall had been unraveling for days, the realization that he was losing settling into his bones, making him sloppy, making him stupid. Lucas kept his voice steady. You've already lost, Randall. All you're doing now is proving that you don't know when to quit. Randall's jaw tightened. Lost? You really think this is over? You think you can just come in here and change the rules? Tell everyone how things are going to work now? He took a step closer, the crowbar still in his grip, his knuckles white around the handle. You don't belong here. Lucas exhaled slowly, finally understanding. This had never really been about the water. It had been about control, about Randall's belief that this was his territory, that he was the one who decided how things worked, that Lucas was just another temporary presence, another new neighbor who would eventually realize that fighting wasn't worth the trouble. But Lucas wasn't temporary, and he had no intention of backing down. You're done, Lucas said. Randall sneered. Yeah? And who's going to stop me? Lucas didn't have to answer, because in that exact moment, the sound of approaching footsteps on gravel filled the air. Two figures appeared at the edge of the property, a uniformed officer and Vanessa Raines, the attorney who had been handling the case. Lucas had anticipated this moment, had known Randall would eventually make a mistake he couldn't talk his way out of. That was why, after filing the initial police report, he had made a follow-up request for a formal witness statement, ensuring that any future escalation would be taken seriously. He had given them everything: footage, timestamps, proof of Randall's repeated trespassing and tampering, and now, with Randall caught in the act, there was nothing left to argue. The officer's voice was calm but firm. Sir, drop the tool and step away from the property. Randall hesitated, his eyes darting between Lucas and the officer, searching for some way out, some last-minute manipulation that might change the outcome. But there was no escape, no more lies, no more excuses. Slowly, stiffly, he dropped the crowbar, the metal clattering against the concrete. Vanessa crossed her arms. I told you this would end badly, she said, her voice cold. You should have listened. Randall didn't respond, didn't look at her. His gaze stayed locked on Lucas, burning with resentment, with hatred, with the unmistakable rage of a man who had lost everything and knew it. The officer took a step closer. Turn around and put your hands behind your back. Randall didn't resist. Not because he had accepted it, but because he knew there was nothing left to do. He had pushed too far for too long, and now there was no one left to save him. Not the neighbors he had manipulated, not the town officials he had convinced to look the other way. It was over. Lucas watched as Randall was led away, his silence feeling heavier than any final threat could have. Because this wasn't just about one man losing. It was about taking back control, about proving that people like Randall, people who thought they could take whatever they wanted, rewrite the rules to suit their needs, weren't untouchable. Lucas hadn't just defended his home. He had changed the entire balance of power in the neighborhood. As he stood there, watching Randall disappear into the distance, he finally let himself breathe. The fight was over, and he had won.